Hello, I'm Roderick McFarker. I'm the person who lectured to you on the Cultural Revolution. And today we're going to have Office Hours 40, which will be about some of the issues you raised during the Cultural Revolution as a result of that lecture. And I'm joined today by Tsai Chang, who's going to make an announcement.
Right. So some of you have suggested that we extend the deadline for Part 9 till a later period, since it's holiday season. So we will take this into consideration and announce the new deadline in the next weekly email.
Tsai Chang, I thought that one of the very interesting questions raised by the students was about Nien Cheng's book, which is a fascinating book, a horrifying book in some ways. Do you want to deal with the question that they raised?
Right. I think some of the students want to know more about the background of Nien Cheng and sort of her life beyond her book as well. So she actually went to London School of Economics when she was young, and she worked for a Shell oil company in the 60s. So she lived a very comfortable lifestyle. So of course, during the Cultural Revolution, she was attacked. She was sent into solitary confinement, into prison in Shanghai for 6.5 years, during which she never confessed. And after she got released, she realized that her own daughter was killed by the Red Guards during the period. And so in the 80s, she went to the United States and she published this book, which is really generated a lot of attention in the Western world.
Yes, it's a very powerful story, especially the fact of her daughter's death, which she discovered late, and her own indomitable courage under pressure. You say she didn't confess. Of course, really she had nothing to confess except what they told her to confess, and she didn't believe in that.
Right. And even by the time they were to release her, they created a story of her crime, which she never admitted to.
Right.
Other questions from the students, a lot of them are interested in the role Zhou Enlai played during the Cultural Revolution.
Well, I think that's fascinating that they should have focused on that, because, of course, that's what many Chinese ask themselves about the role of Zhou Enlai. And some people say that Zhou Enlai had to go with Mao and had to listen to him during the Cultural Revolution, because otherwise he too would have perished. And he was doing his best to keep the country on an even keel. My own feeling is that it is, of course, very difficult to criticize someone like Zhou Enlai, because one doesn't know what one oneself would have done under those circumstances, which were quite terrifying. Mao was quite capable of throwing him on the dustbin of history. But I think that there was a chance in February 1967 when some of the generals and some of the vice premiers objected strongly in a meeting, a top-level meeting, against the Gang of Four and the Cultural Revolution. Had he thrown his hand in with them at that time, there's no way to know whether or not Mao would have felt he had to back off. We know he had to back off a year later, but it's possible that if Zhou Enlai had supported the generals and the vice premiers, maybe Mao would have had to moderate his policies sooner. And it was a cultural revolution, I think, because Mao's aim, genuine aim, this was not just a power struggle, this was not just him throwing the country into confusion because he liked it. Mao's aim really was to transform human beings, to transform particularly the youth, of course, into genuine revolutionary human beings, devoted, of course, to his thought, but also devoted to socialism, to the kind of ideals of world revolution which he himself espoused. And so it was cultural in the sense that you change a person's culture, you change the way they think and the way they act. So in that sense, it was genuinely a cultural revolution, even though in China, shortly after the Cultural Revolution was over, the criticism was it was neither cultural nor great nor even a revolution.
Right. And a lot of students did raise this question. People such as Kath and also Janice Block, they mentioned that Mao was merely using the Red Guards, the youth, as a tool for his own agenda. And it's much more cynical feel?
I think it's understandable that they thought that, because especially after the death of Lin Biao, who had been Mao's chosen heir, there are many people who thought in China this was just a power struggle, and the chairman was being cynical in his use of the Red Guard. I don't think that's true. The tragedy is that Mao thought he was actually changing human beings by the only way they could be changed, which he felt was revolution. Had it just been a power struggle, Mao could have stopped the Cultural Revolution around about January 1967, because by that time his main supposed enemies, like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and others, had already been dismissed.
Right, and that leads us to the main discussion question for this module. So who was responsible for the chaos of the Cultural Revolution? And one student, and Marzian, had a very interesting response. He or she said, I am from Germany and always found it highly dubious and also wrong to say that Adolf Hitler and his henchmen were the only ones, or at least the first to be made responsible for the Holocaust. And so he linked that to Mao's story. So what is your take?
Well, I think there's no question that the student is right in this sense. Mao launched it. Without Mao, as the official verdict said after the Cultural Revolution, without Mao, there would have been no Cultural Revolution. No one would have dared to do what he did. No one would have dared in the initial year of the Cultural Revolution to have swept aside so many senior leaders who had done so much for the country over the previous decade or so. And he wanted to create a new socialist human being. And he saw the future as being vested in the rising generation. If they could be made revolutionary, China would be saved. If China could be saved, the revolution throughout the world would be saved. And so it was an attempt to create artificially the kind of circumstances which Mao and his colleagues found in the country when they were fighting the revolution. They fought a genuine revolution. And Mao had this fantasy that you could create a revolution out of thin air. And he did it by launching the Red Guards to fight against the officials of the party and the government, and in the hopes that they would learn to make revolution, and in the further hopes, of course, that having learned how to make revolution, they'd learn how to run the country. But of course, they just kept on making revolution until he suppressed them. Now, what about the responsibility of the others? Well, you can excuse young people being misled. They were told Mao's thought, and the chairman himself is under pressure, is in danger, and we must defend him. So in a sense, you can excuse people who've been brought up all their lives to understand that Mao was a godlike figure and the epitome of the Chinese Revolution. But I think the real tragedy of the Cultural Revolution was not just that Mao put the country into chaos and there was a lot of killing that resulted. The real tragedy was that it turned Chinese against Chinese, even within families, and certainly among friends and fellow students. And so people had their worst instincts unleashed. And so instead of being your friend, you couldn't trust anyone, because he might betray you to the Red Guards or to the police or to whoever. And so people attacked people because they were frightened. And some, of course, attacked people because they liked attacking people. But the worst part of it was that Mao turned Chinese against other Chinese. And that was, of course, a very difficult thing to forget. I mean, when people were rehabilitated after the Cultural Revolution was over, they often went back to their offices where they had worked before to find the person who denounced them was sitting in their desk. And there's nothing they could do about it. Because if they had, there were people who came back. I know one person in particular who came back to a very senior party position. And there were people like him who wanted to throw out all the people who benefited from the Cultural Revolution. When the Cultural Revolution started, there were 19 million members of the party, roughly. When it ended, there were about 38 million. So the party roughly doubled. And people like my friend wanted to throw out the 19 million who had joined during the Cultural Revolution. That would have been another Cultural Revolution. So he was made to retire.
And that leads to the question, I think most of the students in their answers talk about the Red Guards and the role of Mao and the Gang 4 during the Cultural Revolution. Were there any other groups involved? I mean, you talk about the military in your lecture.
Mao was very happy to unleash the Red Guards, as I said, to make revolution. In fact, at one point, towards the end of 66, beginning of 67, he said, "This is civil war." And he liked the idea. This is exactly what he wanted. Strange though it may seem, since he'd helped to build the country to what it had been. The Gang of Four, Madame Mao in particular, who had enormous anger that she'd been kept from doing anything political, any office holding by the other members of the party, the Gang of Four wanted to stir things up. Particularly, they wanted all the old officials to be thrown out, except for those people they could trust among them. And so they were guilty in the sense that Mao fired the gun, and they took advantage of this to go to student groups in universities, Peking University and so on, and tell them what to do. Encourage them to attack X or Y, who were their enemies. And I think that they must bear part of the blame, though not all the blame as was assigned to them after the Cultural Revolution was over. They were put in the docks, they were given prison sentences, but the chairman was just excused as a great Marxist who made a mistake. What a mistake. So other groups who took advantage, what happened was that student groups formed and attacked other student groups. And so they took advantage. And then there were people, in Wuhan and places like that where there was tremendous strife and killing. People were paid money to kill people of the opposite faction. So they were benefiting from all this killing too. It was a terrible time, and people did things which they wouldn't have done before the Cultural Revolution.
And in the cities, I mean, the local government, the factions within the government were pitted against each other.
Yes, if they survived. But if the Red Guards took over, they became factionalized too. So that was one of the things that disgusted Mao about the Red Guards. And in fact, he said, "You've let me down," because he had hoped that they would become serious rulers of China, at least in embryo anyway. And of course, they formed factions and they fought each other, and that's why he eventually had to suppress them.
And so this lecture is primarily focused on sort of the political history of the Cultural Revolution. And the discussion question also asks students, what other aspects of the Cultural Revolution should we also pay attention to?
Well, I think there has been writing and examination of the culture in the narrow sense, not of the transformation of human beings, but in the sense of art and literature. There was very little of that during the Cultural Revolution. And there have been different viewpoints about the model operas which Nien Cheng, Madame Mao, produced. Some people said they weren't worth the time that was spent on them, and certainly not the time that was spent watching them. Deng Xiaoping, I think, was in that category. But other people in the West have said for people in a rather grim time, the model operas recalled some of the heroic periods of the past in the revolution, and they were light and color, dancing, singing, and so they were a relief. And there is some talk, I think, of some of them being revived.
Yes, I think, at least for my parents' generation, these model operas were their sort of childhood's happiest memories.
Right, right.
And we also talk about the global nature of the Cultural Revolution. And we mentioned the student democratic society. and the Black Panther Party in the United States.
Right. Well, there's no question that the Mao and the Cultural Revolution, the Little Red Book, had an impact globally. It used to be said that every fashionable drawing room, sitting room in Paris would have a little red book on the coffee table to show the sympathies of the house owner. I think one's got to remember that the movement in the United States, certainly the Students for Democratic Society and the freedom riding movement for racial equality in the South, and the free speech movement in Berkeley actually started in the mid-60s, before the Cultural Revolution started. So what you had in the United States were a youth generation who were inspired by the idea that the society in which they lived was wrong, was bad, and that it was too bureaucratic, and that they had to transform it, and particularly so that people of color and people who were poorer could have more power. And to them, the ideals of the Cultural Revolution seemed to resonate. And they didn't know too much about it, of course, because most of them were not China scholars. But many of them embraced the ideas that across the other side of the world was actually a leader, not just people in the streets and students, but a leader who was trying to transform society. And they took great encouragement from that. But I think that among China scholars and scholars of Asia generally, there was a sense that America's war in Vietnam, which was going on at that time, really got going properly in '65, before the Cultural Revolution started, was bad. That American troops should not be in Vietnam. And there would be the demonstrations, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, who do we want to win in America? And I think that the idea that China was on Vietnam's side, even though there were strong differences between the two parties, as it turned out, though China was on Vietnam's side, therefore China was good too. And there was a formation of a group called the Concerned Asian Scholars, who were not just China specialists, but specialists on all parts of Asia. And they led some expeditions to China. They were greeted in China by Zhou Enlai and others. And they were, some of those people now would be considered quite conservative. But in those days they were very radical. And so the Cultural Revolution had this impact on ordinary people who wanted political change in America, Black Panthers who wanted racial change in America, and scholars of Asia who felt that the war in Vietnam was wrong.
But also at the same time, these groups had their own sort of system of ideas and beliefs that's very different from the Cultural Revolution itself. Such as a Student for Democratic Society, the primary aim is for a more participatory democracy. But then, of course, there were radical members of that group.
Well, the radical members were, of course, the weathermen who broke away and who were guilty of one or two bomb outrages. But I think that in the case of the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, what inspired them was not the details of the Cultural Revolution, but the idea that what Mao was doing was attacking bureaucracy. He was attacking the party. He was attacking the officials who controlled the system. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to attack the system and therefore attack the officials. But of course, since they were genuinely democratic, even though radical, the idea that they would have launch a revolution to do it didn't arise, though it did with the Weathermen and did with the Black Panthers. As the student said about Germany, that the leader started and his henchmen encourage it. But, and this is a subject of some argument in the West about Germany, what is the degree of guilt of the ordinary people? Could the Holocaust have happened without the support of ordinary Germans? And that is a subject of much debate. among Western historians of Nazi Germany. And I think in the case of China, obviously, people were unleashed, not just students, but in the countryside. I mean, there are horrific stories about how many people were killed, and indeed cases of cannibalism, purely for political reasons, not because people were hungry or anything like that. And I think that is the great tragedy that which the Chinese people have to come to terms with. It's been blotted out, all that business now. There was a short period of so-called scar literature published immediately after the Cultural Revolution where people would say, how terrible it was for me and my family. But that memory of the Cultural Revolution has now been suppressed. And I think at some point, Chinese people are going to have to come to terms with it. They're going to have to look soberly, like the Germans did about the Nazis, and look soberly at their past and assess the guilt of the chairman and assess the guilt of the party in allowing the chairman to do this, and assess their own guilt in allowing the party to allow the chairman to do this. So it's going to be a long and tortuous historical awakening. It could take decades before people came to terms with this, when they're allowed to do it.
Right. I mean, among my grandparents' generation, there's a lot of private conversations involving the Cultural Revolution, but that's mainly amongst our educated elite who's suffered through the Cultural Revolution. So they have their own version of the story, but we don't have sort of larger discussions, public discussions about this very topic.
No, and of course the educated elite suffered greatly, especially at the beginning. Partly because when the Cultural Revolution started, it's rather amusing, party officials thought, well, this is the same old game as before. Who are the usual suspects? Oh, it's the educated elite. Let's pick a few people and we'll denounce them and that'll be it. But in fact, they didn't realize that the chairman was aiming at themselves, the party elite. And so though the intellectuals did suffer during the Cultural Revolution, especially at the hands of the Red Guard, it was in fact the party elite who suffered more. And there is this strong campaign in China today against corruption. And even people in the party itself, leaders of the party, like Hu Jintao and of course Xi Jinping, who's overseeing the current campaign, admit that corruption is widespread from top to bottom. And I have a sense that one reason why it's widespread is the following. In the years up to the Cultural Revolution, the motto of the party was serve the people. And many people would say that the party didn't really do that. It often took advantage of the people, it exploited their position of power and so on. Nevertheless, that was the motto. And there were surely genuine party members who were very sincere about that motto. I think that what happened as a result of the Cultural Revolution, when party members at all levels of the party were humiliated, beaten, sometimes killed throughout China, I think there was a sort of enormous resentment at this, not surprising. And that afterwards, after the Cultural Revolution, as Deng Xiaoping opened up and reformed and said to get rich is glorious, I think party people said to themselves, or at least some of them, well, if to get rich is glorious, why shouldn't I get rich too and my family? We served the people, and what happened? We were humiliated, we were beaten, we were scorned. Now we'll get rich like everyone else. And I think that, plus a number of economic policies, I think that led to a change in the morale of the party. There's no question that the Cultural Revolution was one of the great tragedies of the People's Republic of China. And when I think about it, however, it's not the greatest tragedy. In fact, I think that you could say that the party has been responsible for three great tragedies for the Chinese people. The first, obviously, and the most costly in human life, of course, was the Great Famine following the Great Leap, another of Mao's fantastic ideas. Then there was the Cultural Revolution, his attempt to transform human beings into different kinds of revolutionary actors. And then there's the tragedy that's currently being enacted, and that is the tragedy of the ecological disaster that's taking place all over China. And though we don't know how many lives are lost to cancer as a result of pollution and so on, to asthma as a result of air pollution, what I think we can say already is that that tragedy will last far longer and probably affect more people even than the Cultural Revolution. Perhaps not as many as the Great Famine, but we are witnessing a great tragedy even at this moment.